In a quiet Vermont town, a female mechanic named Nancy Whitaker took on a simple project restoring a forgotten veteran's motorcycle left to rust in an old barn. But as she cleaned away the grime, she uncovered something chilling. The soldier's name had been erased from history. No records, no trace, just silence. What started as a restoration became a mission to give that forgotten veteran the honor he was denied. This powerful story of a lost war hero, a restored motorcycle, and a truth buried for decades will move you in ways you never expected. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. Nancy Whitaker had built her life with grease-stained hands and the roar of engines echoing in her ears. At 46, she ran a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of a quiet town in Vermont, known for her no-nonsense attitude and unmatched skills under the hood. Nancy was respected by locals but kept mostly to herself. The walls of her garage were lined with vintage license plates and war-era memorabilia, most of them forgotten relics left behind by customers long gone. One crisp autumn afternoon, Nancy attended an estate auction at a derelict barn scheduled for demolition. There, buried beneath a pile of rusted scrap and moldy tarps, she spotted something that made her heart pause: a vintage military motorcycle, corroded and silent, but somehow dignified. The auctioneer offered it for a few bucks, calling it junk metal. But to Nancy, it was something more. She hauled the forgotten machine back to her shop, intending to restore it during the slow winter months. What she didn't know was that this motorcycle held a secret one, buried beneath layers of rust and time, waiting for someone stubborn enough, skilled enough, and heartbroken enough to bring it back to life. The first week of working on the motorcycle passed quietly. Nancy spent her evenings in the garage, wiping down rusted chrome, soaking bolts in oil, and sketching wiring diagrams on the back of old pizza boxes. It wasn't her first restoration, but something about this bike felt different, older, heavier, like it carried more than just rust, like it carried memory. As she disassembled the fuel tank, she found the first clue. Etched lightly beneath a layer of grime was a faded set of initials T, J, W, followed by what looked like a military serial number. It was barely legible, almost lost under decades of corrosion. Her breath caught as she leaned in with a flashlight. Military gear was no stranger to Nancy. Her late father had served in Korea, and she had grown up listening to stories about dog tags, lost brothers, and motorcycles roaring through post-war parades. The serial number haunted her all night. By morning, she had made up her mind. After closing the shop early, she drove to the local Veterans Hall to ask around. Most of the old-timers there didn't recognize the bike or the initials, but one man, Harold Red Jennings, a 91-year-old World War II medic, paused when she showed him a photo. This looks like the kind of bike we rode in Normandy, he said slowly. See that bracket under the seat? That's for a side holster. We used to bolt our rifles there when moving between checkpoints. Nancy leaned in. Ever know anyone with the initials T, J? You? Red stared off into the distance, lips moving silently as if flipping through a dusty photo album in his mind. Then, he shook his head. Not off the top of my head. But if he served in our unit, there should be a record. Try the county archive. They keep the draft logs from back then. Nancy thanked him and left, heart racing faster than her shop's newest Harley. That night, she barely slept. This wasn't just some restoration anymore, it was an investigation. Someone had ridden this motorcycle in wartime. Someone had survived, or hadn't, and now she needed to know who. The next day, she visited the county archive, a quiet red brick building hidden between a post office and a bakery. Inside, The musty air smelled of forgotten history. She flipped through binders and microfilm reels for hours, searching for any mention of a T.J. with a matching serial number. Nothing came up. Not a name, not a unit, not a photo. It was as if he had never existed. Frustrated, but determined. Nancy scanned deeper, cross-checking military discharge records, handwritten enlistment logs, even death certificates from the era. Still nothing. She paused and stared at the motorcycle frame photo again, eyes drawn to the serial number. Suddenly, she noticed something odd. The numbers had been re-stamped. Someone had deliberately tampered with the identification marks. Her gut twisted. She had worked with dozens of vintage bikes before. The stamping on this one wasn't factory-made. It was uneven, almost rushed. Whoever had owned this motorcycle had tried to cover their tracks, or someone else had tried to erase them. Nancy sat back in her chair, the weight of it sinking in. Why would someone erase a veteran's identity? Later that week, she reached out to a military historian she'd met once at a car show. After sending him photos of the motorcycle and the markings, he called her back almost immediately. "This is rare," he said. "You may have stumbled onto a ghost case." "A what?" "A ghost case," he repeated. "Soldiers who fell through the cracks, no official death, no proper discharge. Sometimes it's a bureaucratic error, sometimes it's intentional." Nancy's hands trembled. Intentional. "There were rumors," he said carefully. "Rumors of soldiers being reassigned off the books, covert missions. Some never came home. Some were scrubbed from the records altogether." A silence hung between them. Nancy looked at the motorcycle, now half restored and gleaming under her garage light. It didn't just carry oil and rust, it carried a lost man's legacy, a man the world had chosen to forget. But she wouldn't forget. Not now. A week later, Nancy was elbow-deep in grease when the knock came. It was early, barely past sunrise, and the air outside still clung to the last chill of winter. Wiping her hands on a rag, she opened the door to find a young man in a military-style jacket, no older than 25, standing on her porch with a backpack and a folder in hand. "Are you Nancy Whitaker?" he asked. "I am," she replied cautiously. "My name's Eli Thompson. I think that motorcycle belonged to my grandfather." Nancy's heart skipped. "Come in." They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the smell of fresh coffee mixing with the oil-stained scent from the garage. Eli opened the folder and slid a black-and-white photo across the table. It showed a young soldier leaning against a nearly identical motorcycle. The resemblance was uncanny. Even the scratches on the fuel tank matched. "That's him," Eli said. "Thomas James Walker." "Type J. You?" Nancy felt her breath catch. The initials on the frame, the erased serial, everything aligned. "I've been looking for answers for years," Eli continued. "My mom, his daughter, was born after the war. He never came back. No death record, no discharge papers. Just gone." Nancy stared at the photo, her voice low. The serial number was re-stamped. Someone tried to erase his history. Eli nodded solemnly. "My grandmother used to whisper that he was taken for something bigger. She said he wrote letters about a mission in France, something secret. Then they just stopped. She died believing the government buried it all." Nancy rubbed her forehead, trying to process it. "I've checked every local archive. There's no trace of him. That's why I came," Eli said, pulling out a weathered envelope. "I found this 2 weeks ago in my grandmother's attic. It's a letter he wrote, but it was never mailed." The postmark's from 1945. Nancy unfolded the letter with care. The paper was fragile, yellowed, written in a looping hand. If this letter reaches you, it means something went wrong. I'm being reassigned no papers, no orders, just a name on a list. We leave at dawn. They say it's for the good of the country. I hope one day the truth finds its way back. There was no signature, just the initials T.J. Nancy felt a chill snake down her spine. She'd worked with steel and machines her whole life. But this wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a voice, a whisper across time. "Eli," she said softly, "do you want to help me finish restoring it?" The young man's eyes lit up. I'd be honored. From that day forward, they worked side by side. Nancy taught Eli how to strip chrome, replace pistons, align gears. He brought stories his grandmother had told about how Thomas loved jazz music, how he'd ride his motorcycle to the edge of town just to watch trains pass, how he once built a radio out of scrap wire. Every bolt they turned felt like bringing Thomas Walker back to life. But the biggest shock came 3 weeks later. While polishing the undercarriage, Eli spotted something odd, a hidden compartment tucked beneath the seat. With careful effort, they pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather notebook, stamped with military insignia. Nancy opened it slowly. Inside were pages of names, locations, and coded messages. None of it was in official format. It was handwritten, some pages smudged, others torn. But one thing was clear. Thomas Walker hadn't disappeared. He had been part of an unofficial post-war operation, one that had been buried by the very people who sent him. "Do you realize what this is?" Nancy whispered. "It's proof," Eli replied. "Proof he existed. Proof he mattered." Tears welled up in Nancy's eyes. After decades of silence, the truth had found its way home, hidden in the guts of a forgotten motorcycle, protected by rust and time. But what would they do with it now? For days, Nancy couldn't sleep. The leather notebook sat on her kitchen table like a silent witness, fragile, scarred, and painfully real. She had read every word inside it, most of them twice. Dates, coordinates, names, short entries that didn't make much sense to a civilian, but collectively painted a picture Thomas James Walker had been reassigned in late 1945 to a classified unit tasked with post-war extractions in Eastern Europe. He'd documented encounters, intercepted communications, and even noted conflicting orders he didn't understand. Some names were crossed out, some had stars next to them, some had the word lost. There was no doubt this was evidence of a mission that had never officially existed. Nancy sat across from Eli, the notebook between them. The weight of it seemed to press into their lungs. "You ever wonder," Eli asked, "why they tried so hard to erase him?" Nancy nodded slowly. Because if someone knew, they'd have to answer for it. It was no longer just about restoring a motorcycle. It wasn't even about honoring a forgotten veteran. It had become something deeper, a calling to restore truth. The next day, they contacted a military historian from Washington. Dipwantsi, someone Nancy's friend had mentioned weeks earlier, Dr. Lyle Emerson, a retired intelligence officer turned archivist. He agreed to meet them after reviewing photos of the notebook and motorcycle. Inside his private study, surrounded by rows of declassified war documents and Cold War maps. Dr. Emerson examined the notebook with a reverence usually reserved for ancient texts. "This," he whispered, "isn't just rare, it's dangerous." "Dangerous?" Nancy asked. Dr. Emerson nodded. "This unit, it was real, but not acknowledged. They handled asset extractions, often without formal orders. Most didn't survive long. Those who did either disappeared or were told to forget. The government needed shadows back then." Eli's jaw clenched. "So what now? We just keep it quiet." Dr. Emerson looked at him. That depends. What do you want? The question lingered in the air like smoke. On the drive home, Nancy gripped the steering wheel tight. For years, she had buried herself in machines because they were simple, broken things could be fixed. But now she understood. Some things aren't broken. They're buried. And the world doesn't always want them dug up. But Eli had changed, too. He no longer looked like a confused grandson chasing a myth. He looked like someone carrying a torch. His posture was different, his eyes sharper. He had started recording voice memos about the process, interviewing elderly locals, researching military base closures and archived newspapers. It was no longer just about his grandfather. It was about all the names in that notebook, and the people who never got closure. One evening, Nancy walked into the garage to find Eli staring at the now gleaming motorcycle. The paint had been restored to its original deep green. The leather seat, stitched by hand. Every bolt tightened with care. "It's finished," he said. Nancy placed a hand on the handlebar. "It's just the beginning." He turned to her. "What if we wrote it to D.C., delivered the notebook in person, to someone who can actually put it in the record?" She hesitated. "That's a long ride." Eli smiled. "Then we'd better start early." 2 weeks later, the journey began. Nancy and Eli took turns riding the motorcycle through winding New England roads, past forgotten towns and memorials that had long since faded into the background of modern life. They stopped at diners, met veterans, and told the story. People cried. Some shared their own stories, fathers, uncles, brothers who had never come home. The story resonated. It was like everyone had a Thomas Walker in their family, someone who'd slipped through the cracks of history. By the time they reached Deepmau, news had spread. A local journalist had picked up their journey and published a feature. By morning, national outlets were calling. They arrived at the National Archives on a bright spring afternoon. The motorcycle gleamed in the sunlight. A small crowd had gathered: veterans, families, students. Reporters held microphones. Eli clutched the notebook as if it were made of glass. Nancy leaned toward him. "You ready?" "No," he said. "But it's not about me. It's about him." Inside, they were greeted by officials who had once said this kind of record didn't exist. Now, they handled it like sacred text. The notebook was scanned, preserved, and accepted into the archives with a promise an official investigation would follow. Before they left, Nancy asked for one thing. "Put his name somewhere," she said. "Not just a file, a wall, a plaque. Something someone can touch." The director nodded. "We'll make sure of it." That evening, back at their motel, Nancy stood outside smoking a cigarette, a habit she'd picked up and dropped a dozen times. Eli sat beside her, legs stretched, eyes toward the horizon. "Thank you," he said. She didn't respond right away. The sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows on the parking lot. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think fixing machines was the only way I could help people, but maybe fixing stories matters more." Eli looked at her, eyes damp. "You didn't just fix his story. You brought it back to life." In the heart of Washington, months later, a small bronze plaque was placed near the World War II memorial. It read, "Thomas James Walker, U.S. Army, 1944-1945. Erased from records, never forgotten." A month had passed since the plaque was unveiled in Washington. But the ripple effects had only just begun. Nancy Whitaker had returned to her small Vermont town, expecting life to settle back into the familiar rhythm of oil changes and carburetor cleanings. But something had shifted, not just in the town, but in her. Her garage no longer felt like a place to simply repair machines. It had become a story hub, A place where people stopped by not for a tune-up, but to talk. They came with questions, with photos, with missing names and faded dog tags. "Could you help me find my father's records? My uncle disappeared in '46. No one ever told us how. My grandmother said he wasn't listed on the memorial wall." Could that be true? At first, Nancy was overwhelmed. She wasn't a historian or a government agent, just a mechanic who followed a hunch. But every time she looked at the polished green motorcycle now mounted near her front window, she remembered. The truth is often hidden in the places no one thinks to look. Eli, meanwhile, had embraced a new mission. He launched a digital project called The Forgotten Ledger, using the scanned pages of his grandfather's notebook as a foundation. With the help of volunteers, historians, veterans, tech-savvy college students, they began to map out connections, decode locations, and cross-reference military aliases. The project went viral within weeks. Local news covered it first, then national. Families began submitting documents, photographs, and first-hand accounts. Eli added a memorial page for each confirmed erased name, giving them a digital headstone when history had failed to provide a real one. Nancy watched it all unfold with pride. She wasn't tech-savvy, but she knew how to spot something real. This wasn't just a side project. It was a movement. One afternoon, Nancy received a call from the Veterans Legacy Foundation, a national nonprofit that focused on restoring honors to misrecorded or forgotten veterans. "We'd like to invite you to join our advisory council," the woman on the line said. Nancy nearly dropped the phone. "Me. You uncovered a case no one else would have. You reminded the nation that truth sometimes lives outside official records. We think your experience is invaluable." Nancy looked at her grease-stained hands. She thought about saying no. She was just a mechanic, just a woman who couldn't sleep, and decided to restore a motorcycle to keep her mind busy. But then she remembered something her father once told her. When you know the truth, you don't sit on it. You ride it till the road ends. She accepted the invitation. By summer, Nancy and Eli were invited to speak at the National Memorial Forum, a yearly gathering of military families, veterans, and historians. They stood side by side at the podium in front of hundreds. Eli spoke first. "I used to think the world forgot my grandfather, but I realize now we forgot to ask. We forgot to listen. And we forgot that sometimes the answers aren't in the official files. Sometimes they're tucked in garages, whispered in old letters, or hidden in the back of someone's memory." Nancy followed, a little nervous at first, but clear in her voice. "I spent my life fixing broken things. I always thought people were different, that once something shattered inside, it stayed broken. But I was wrong. Sometimes, the smallest thing like a rusted bolt on an old bike can lead to healing that generations never thought possible." When they finished, the standing ovation felt like thunder. Not because they had all the answers, but because they gave people permission to start asking questions again. Weeks later, Nancy received a letter from an elderly man in Oregon. His name was Edward R. Jennings, and he'd once served in the same unit as Thomas Walker. "I thought I was the last one left." He wrote, "But after hearing about your discovery, I went through my old locker, found a photograph one I never dared to share. It's of Thomas, alive, and smiling. I hope it helps." Inside the envelope was a photo of 6 soldiers, arms around each other, standing next to the very same motorcycle Nancy had restored. In the center, unmistakably, was Thomas Walker. He was laughing. Nancy framed it and placed it in her shop. Right above the bike, later that month, a local high school teacher asked Nancy and Eli to speak to her students. What was supposed to be a 30-minute visit turned into a 2-hour Q&A. One student asked, "Why did they erase people like your grandfather?" Eli didn't hesitate. "Because when people vanish from records, No one has to explain what happened to them. Erasure is the easiest kind of silence. Another student raised her hand. And how do we stop that? Nancy smiled gently. By refusing to forget. By remembering that behind every number, every name on a page or not on a page, there's a story worth fighting for. Before long, the garage became more than just a shop. It became a community space, a place where veterans and families gathered on Saturdays, where volunteers scanned documents, where Eli hosted monthly story restoration nights, helping others piece together missing legacies. Nancy even began teaching basic restoration classes, especially to young women, showing them how to hold a wrench, how to polish chrome, how to listen not just to machines, but to the people who'd once ridden them. And the motorcycle? It never rode again. It didn't need to. It had already taken 2 generations on a journey that changed them and others forever. It now stood behind glass, front and center in the garage, with a small plaque that read, "This machine carried a man erased by history, and a truth too heavy to bury." It had been 6 months since the plaque in D.C. was installed. 6 months since Nancy and Eli had opened the door to a past that refused to stay buried. The garage had transformed. Where there were once rusted axles and broken mufflers, now there were community bulletin boards covered with photos of veterans, lost letters, and handwritten notes from grateful families. Some brought folded flags, others just brought stories. Nancy had changed, too. She moved slower these days, not from age, but from weight, not physical, but emotional. She carried more than grease now. She carried legacy, grief, responsibility, and love. And Eli, he was no longer the lost grandson chasing a ghost. He had become a voice for the voiceless. His Forgotten Ledger project had expanded nationwide. He'd even been asked to consult on a documentary about hidden veterans and erased wartime missions. But nothing prepared them for the envelope that arrived one rainy October afternoon. It had no return address. Inside was a single photograph, clearly old, frayed at the edges. Nancy's fingers trembled as she pulled it out. In the photo, a man in uniform stood beside the motorcycle. He wasn't smiling. His eyes were intense, watchful. And unlike the photos they had of Thomas Walker, this man was not him. At the back of the photo, one sentence was scrawled in sharp black ink. "He wasn't who you think he was." Nancy stared at the words for a long time. Then she called Eli. They sat in the garage under the flickering ceiling light, staring at the photo. A storm raged outside, the wind howling through the trees. "I don't understand," Eli whispered. "That's not my grandfather." "No," Nancy said quietly. "But that's the same motorcycle. Same saddlebag tear, same scratch on the fuel tank." Eli rubbed his forehead. So either someone else used it before him, or someone else used his name. A chilling silence followed. What if the real Thomas Walker never made it home, he said. Nancy's stomach dropped. Everything they'd done, every honor, every memorial was based on a trail they assumed belonged to Thomas Walker. But what if someone had taken his identity? What if the man in the notebook wasn't the man in the stories? And then Eli broke. Tears welled up in his eyes. "I just wanted to know him," he said. "I just wanted to believe that the man in those photos was mine, that I came from someone who mattered, someone who didn't just disappear without reason." Nancy reached over, gripping his hand. Her voice cracked. "He still matters. Whether he died wearing that name or someone else wore it for him, his memory led us here. His story helped hundreds of families find peace. Eli, that's more than most people ever leave behind." He nodded slowly, wiping his face. But the pain lingered. The following week, they reopened the investigation not to undo what they had discovered, but to expand it. They traced military gear logs, Black Ops deployment manifests, and Cold War prisoner exchange records. What they found was devastating. Thomas James Walker had likely died in 1945 during a covert mission overseas. The man who returned under his name was a fellow soldier in the same unit. A man who assumed his identity either out of necessity or survival. The Thomas Walker who had raised Eli's mother wasn't biologically Thomas at all. Eli sat in silence when they confirmed it. His entire family tree had shifted in a single afternoon. But Nancy, quietly, placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Blood doesn't make a man your family. Legacy does. And whoever he was, he gave you this journey. He gave you the courage to find the truth." Eli didn't speak. He just nodded, tears falling silently. Later that month, Eli held a small ceremony. He replaced the plaque in the garage with a new one. It no longer bore just one name. Instead, it read, "For those whose names were borrowed, erased, or forgotten, your stories still ride with us." People cried. Nancy cried. And for the first time in years, Eli saw his mother smile through tears. Not because she had clarity, but because she had peace. That night, Nancy stood alone in the garage. She ran her fingers across the motorcycle seat, now worn soft from time and memory. She whispered, "You never needed a name to matter. You just needed someone to care." The light flickered once, then steadied. And for the first time, she felt like someone had answered back. Winter came gently that year. The first snowfall dusted the roof of Nancy's garage like powdered sugar. Inside, the warm glow of hanging Edison bulbs cast long shadows over the now famous military motorcycle. Visitors still came every week, some from nearby towns, others from across the country. Some arrived with folders, others with folded flags, but they all came with heavy hearts and unanswered questions. Nancy greeted each one with quiet strength. A cup of coffee, a chair by the heater, and the most powerful gift she could offer, a listening ear. One afternoon, as soft snow blanketed the windows, Nancy sat with a woman in her 70s, clutching a black and white photograph of her father. "I don't know if he was a hero," the woman said, her voice cracking. "I just know he never came home, and I never got to say goodbye." Nancy didn't say much. She didn't need to. She simply took the photo, pressed it gently to her chest, and whispered, "Then let's make sure the world knows he was here." That simple promise had become her life's mission. Meanwhile, Eli had turned the Forgotten Ledger project into a national initiative. It now had chapters in over 30 states, with volunteers hosting Legacy Days events where families could scan old letters, catalog military memorabilia, and add their loved ones to the digital memorial wall. Eli often spoke at schools, universities, even veteran centers. But one speech stood out above the rest. It was a clear spring day when he stood at the National Cemetery in front of a crowd of students and military families. He brought no script, just a dog tag in his hand. "My grandfather wasn't who I thought he was. He began. But in chasing his story, I discovered something greater, a truth we all need to hear." He held up the tag. This belonged to a man who lived under someone else's name. He wasn't perfect. He may have made mistakes, but he raised a daughter, served a country, and inspired a search for justice that helped hundreds of others find peace. He paused. We all carry names, family names, national identities, labels others put on us, but those don't define who we are. Our choices do. Our love does. The stories we tell and the ones we dare to uncover, that's what makes us unforgettable. The crowd stood in silence, then applause, then tears. Back in Vermont, Nancy received a letter from a woman in France. It was written in delicate cursive. She explained that her grandfather had served alongside American soldiers during the liberation. One of them, she said, had saved his life but disappeared after the mission. She had searched for that soldier's name for years. All she remembered was the initials Tempunchong. At the bottom of the letter was a photo. A younger Thomas Walker, unmistakable, standing beside a French boy, holding a half-broken violin. Nancy wept. Even after everything, the stolen identity, the doubts Thomas had existed, not just in war records, but in people, in stories, in lives saved. She printed the photo and placed it in the garage, right above the old ledger book. Beneath it, she wrote, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you awaken in others." Years later, on a crisp spring morning, Nancy sat on the front step of her garage, watching Eli play catch with his young son, Thomas Eli Walker. The boy wore a bomber jacket 2 sizes too big and had a habit of asking questions about everything. Nancy smiled. "You think he'll remember all this?" she asked Eli. Eli looked at his son, then at Nancy. "He won't have to," he said softly, "because we wrote it down. And now, it'll never be forgotten." That night, Nancy locked up the garage for the last time. She turned off the lights. The glow faded slowly, leaving only the soft outline of the motorcycle in the dark. She placed her hand on the cold glass of the display case. "I carried you for a long time," she whispered. "Now you carry all of us." She stepped outside, looked up at the stars, the same sky that had watched over Thomas, over every soldier who never came home, and over every family still waiting for answers. And for the first time in her life, Nancy Whitaker felt at peace. The story of Nancy Whitaker and Eli Walker reminds us that truth doesn't always come neatly filed in an archive or recorded in ink. Sometimes, it's buried under rust, silence, and fear. And yet, even when forgotten by official history, a single name whispered, remembered, or rediscovered can reignite legacy. We live in a world where stories are lost every day. Veterans who carried their burdens in silence. Families who never received answers. People whose identities were altered, erased, or rewritten. But when someone cares enough to ask, to listen, and to restore, something powerful happens. We don't just bring back the past, we heal the present. This story isn't just about a motorcycle or a name on a plaque. It's about the courage to face uncomfortable truths and the grace to honor even imperfect legacies. Because everyone, no matter how small their footprint, deserves to be remembered. The end. Up next. 2 more true stories you won't want to miss. Tap to continue the journey, and if you believe every voice matters, don't forget to subscribe.